Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Impact 100 Philadelphia's Spring Education Program, Reading the Room, How Funders and Allies Can Understand the Needs of Nonprofits by Listening. I'm Kim Kirn, Executive Director of Impact 100 Philadelphia, and I'm your host and your moderator for this evening. We're going to be discussing a wonderful report from the United Way, the Philadelphia Foundation, and the Urban Affairs Coalition titled Reflecting Forward, Philadelphia-based Black nonprofit leaders' recommendations for regional funders. I had the privilege of hearing the report's findings presented at a Philanthropy Network webinar last summer. And when we started talking about what our spring education program might be this year, it immediately came to mind. And I think the report's positioning is really clearly stated in the foreword by Charmaine Matlock Turner, who's CEO of the Urban Affairs Coalition, as well as an Impact 100 Philadelphia member. And she says, and I'm going to read to make sure that I quote her accurately, "Leaders in philanthropy, ask yourself, is your funding process fair and equitable? What are your biases? Have you really examined them? As you answer these questions, we urge you to take the next step on this journey. Get to know us, trust us, and embrace trust-based philanthropy." To my mind, a clear invitation to action if ever there was one. Impact 100 has been on a journey toward being a more equitable and fair funder since our founding in 2008 by our two founding members, Beth Dolly and Mary Broach. And while we've worked to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion a little bit more each year, there have been a few highlights in our history that I think are worth mentioning here. In 2017, we moved from project funding to general operating funding. So all of our high impact grants are for general operating rather than a specific project for our recipients. And this year, we made a series of changes to more accurately reflect the principles of trust-based philanthropy and continue our journey on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've moved from a two-step to a single-step application process. We lowered the floor of our eligibility. So organizations with budgets of $300,000 to $3 million are now eligible to apply for our funding. And we will now be providing stipends to organizations that do host a site visit from our members, but do not ultimately advance as a finalist in their focus area. But there is always more work that we can do, and tonight's esteemed panel are just the folks to help us explore these options. You can see their bios on our website on the page about tonight's event, but here they are with you as well. We are joined tonight by Kelly Woodland, who is Managing Director of Leadership Equity at the United Way of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. He'll be presenting the report's findings and some key contexts for us. And then sharing her foundation's road to trust-based philanthropy with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion is Mindy Aldridge, who's president of the Nelson Foundation. Unfortunately, Charmaine Matlock Turner cannot be with us this evening due to a death in her family, and our thoughts and condolences, of course, go out to Charmaine and her loved ones in this difficult time. Without further ado, I do want to hand the program over to Kelly, with one additional reminder, which is that if you have questions as the panel goes on this evening, and then we will have time for audience Q&A, please drop those into the Q&A feature of your Zoom so that our moderators can see them and compile them for the Q&A portion. Okay, Kelly, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Kim. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the many members of Impact 100 Philadelphia. It's a pleasure to be afforded an opportunity to discuss this important work. Before I start, let me just give a little bit of a preamble on me and how I came to this work. I'm Managing Director of Leadership Equity for the United Way, as Kim mentioned. And leadership equity is a term that I've coined. And really what it means is ensuring that all nonprofit leaders of color are afforded the resources and opportunities necessary to effectively steward their organizations and capably serve their communities. And what I envision is that leadership equity is evidenced by three key benchmarks. One, the nonprofit sector has a pipeline committed to identifying and growing the pool of emerging leaders of color and preparing them for future leadership. Number two, when leaders of color are trusted and valued as experienced and expert partners and civic thought leaders. And three, when leaders of color are sufficiently resourced to create and implement strategies and solutions that address the needs of their communities. So my charge at the United Way is just twofold. One, supporting Black nonprofit leadership, and two, to be perfectly honest with you, is to facilitate and embark on a process to reset the relationship between funders and Black nonprofit leaders. So I'm just going to go very quickly because I know we have a little bit of time, and I really want to get into these findings, but just my background, I've been in the nonprofit sector for a very long time and have a variety of experiences developing and managing pre-college programs, developing the first STEM program, targeting Black and brown youth at the nationally known Science Museum. I led a community-based community development corporation in one of Philadelphia's historic communities, and actually led a community-wide strategic planning process, worked at a large regional foundation and created a community-based network model that was replicated in 2 Midwestern cities. I've been a consultant working with both nonprofits and funders, and most recently led a youth-serving nonprofit organization that served Philadelphia and Camden. And while I'll readily admit that those experiences are very deep, it's not the depth of my experiences, but the angles that I've been afforded that's been most valuable to the current work that I'm trying to take on. So, and I give all that context because when folks ask, what is the value of Black nonprofit leadership? I have a certain angle on that question. I'll share one reason, just one reason. There are many, but I'm going to share just one. Cultural competency. And I'm going to break that down. Cultural competency allows you to understand where and how the rubber hits the road as it pertains to serving and supporting communities of color. The personal experience of having been impacted by the very services that you're attempting to address. So for example, Black nonprofit leaders often have more than a surfacey understanding of the foundational things that are key to serving communities of color, such as how you recruit for certain programs, what interventions are more effective and why, how to foster respectful partnerships, identifying community decision makers, understanding who are the decision makers in the community, who's doing what and where. And these examples alone, they're just program centered, but I wanted to emphasize these things because they're not only advantages that Black nonprofits have, but it's the only way that it isn't the only way that cultural competency is reflected. Another example that is part of the Black experience in this country and that spills over into how we lead our nonprofit organizations is historically doing more with less and being resourceful. Also, the Black experience in this country has created a perspective and a sensitivity to the issues and to the work that's very difficult to replicate. So when I speak about Black nonprofit leaders, we didn't just start thinking about the issues that we're attempting to address. We didn't just start thinking about them when we went to college or when we went to grad school. These have been the drivers behind why we do what we do. So all of that context begs a very important question, and that is, if we make up a sizable portion of vulnerable communities in this country that need supports and services, why can't we be the ones creating and driving the solutions and implementing the strategies and leading the organizations doing the work? Okay, next slide. The name of the report that was released in June 2022 is called Reflecting Forward, Philadelphia-based nonprofit leaders' recommendations for regional funders. Next, to really understand the Reflecting Forward report, want to back up a little bit and consider the 2016 report that was titled Philadelphia's Nonprofit Human Service Organizations, How African-American-Led Organizations Differ from White-Led Organizations. That really set the table for the current Reflecting Forward report. And I mention that specifically because, one, I didn't just come upon this 6 months ago. This is work that was built on a study and research that was released in 2016. But as I indicated, it is also inspired and informed, and the impetus was really over 35 years of work in the nonprofit sector, working with nonprofits as well as philanthropy. Now, when you look at the 2016 report, that was aimed at getting a better understanding of the challenges faced by Black nonprofit leaders and the value led of Black nonprofit organizations and how we really contribute to the nonprofit system. It was commissioned by an organization that I co-founded, the Philadelphia African American Leadership Forum. The Urban Affairs Coalition provided the project oversight, and the United Way provided the support. It dealt with 145 nonprofit executives, white and Black. We had focus groups and surveys, interviews, and that report was Philadelphia's nonprofit human service organizations, how African-American-led organizations differ from white-led organizations. So when I talk about reflecting forward, it's not to be looked at in isolation. It's a continuation. The reflecting forward is actually was done 5 years later. Next. When you talk about the 2016 findings, I'm not going to go all of them that are on the screen, but I'll just mention a few of them that were really important that I want to bring out. The report findings from 2016 were Black-led nonprofits were smaller, as defined by the number of staff and volunteers. Black-led nonprofits had fewer cash reserves. That's important. Black-led nonprofits were more dependent upon government grants. Those two findings are related because if you're reliant on government grants and you're waiting to get reimbursed, then you're going to dip into your cash reserves. The findings must be looked at in the context of each other because oftentimes Black-led nonprofit organizations were penalized for having few cash reserves. So this report was really helpful in contextualizing the circumstances that Black-led nonprofits had. Also, Black-led nonprofits were more likely to track data and program outcomes. And that finding was actually a surprise because oftentimes funders had said that Black-led organizations weren't collecting data. But you know why they were collecting data? Because they had a government contract. So again, those three findings are related to each other. Also, Black-led organizations were more likely to serve and be located in low-income Philadelphia neighborhoods. And Black leaders reported more significant challenges with fundraising than white leaders. Next slide. The principal researcher for the Reflecting Forward report was Dr. Kelly Sloan. The important thing to know about this is Kelly Sloan was also involved in the first report that was released in 2016 that was produced by Branch Associates. So we had the continuity of someone who understood the context, but also was able to bring expertise and a current contemporary lens to the work. Next. The research design of the Reflecting Forward report included references to the 2016 finding and some of the changes over time. Plus, as we all know, we had to utilize the backdrop of both COVID and the murder of George Floyd and how those conditions influence circumstances. And we also included recommendations and actions from Black nonprofit leaders. Next. There were several questions asked of Black nonprofit leaders in the Reflecting Forward report, but the most, I guess, central of those questions was, how can regional funders best support the needs of Black nonprofit leaders and Black serving organizations? In addition, each was also asked to share their perspective on the pandemic, campaigns for racial justice, and other recommendations for regional funders. Next. So here, I'm going to talk about the recommendations from the Reflecting Forward report. And the one thing that I can honestly say, and I think it's the beauty of this current report, is in its simplicity and the clarity of the recommendations from Black nonprofit leaders. Also, these recommendations are very durable. So this is the meat of our presentation. So I'm going to take some time to contextualize the recommendations with actual quotes from the report to illuminate some of the findings. So the first recommendation is get to know us. Now that's a very simple request. The 2016 branch report pointed to Black leaders having very little social capital, meaning their social and professional networks did not include folks with access to funders, donor gatekeepers, key decision makers, or people with vast influence. So that's a gap that must be closed. And the one thing that I can honestly say when I reflect upon my particular experience as a professional in the nonprofit sector for over 35 years is that funders invest in leaders. Okay, I'll say that again. Funders invest in leaders. Funders won't and they can't invest in leaders they don't know. Why? Because that's a risk. One of the quotes from the Reflecting Forward report is, and it really expressed that funders consider Black-led organizations risky. This person said, people give money to who they know. And it's one of the reasons why we see white-led organizations getting more money. It's not that their work is any more important than ours. They have the relationships. When you get to know Black nonprofit leaders, you'll see the competency, you'll see the skills, you'll see the financial acumen required to consistently do more with less. But what was a concern that Black nonprofit leaders expressed is that it appeared that some funders seem to put Black nonprofit leaders in, and their organizations, in an assigned risk pool. Okay, now as I indicated, the beauty of this report is that it's very simple. You can very easily address the recommendation of get to know us. So when we talk about how you can get to know us, be intentional. One thing every funder has is the power to convene. When you invite people, they come. Create opportunities to connect with Black nonprofit leaders. One of the things that I did when I first came to the United Way is I sponsored a Get to Know Us event. And that was a networking event that brought together over 85 nonprofit leaders and funders. I'm going to do a similar event, although it won't be a networking event, on April 20th at the African American Music Museum of Philadelphia. The second recommendation is embrace trust-based philanthropy. Trust-based philanthropy, and you've heard Kim talk about the changes that Impact 100 implemented in pursuit of reaching trust-based philanthropy. And that's acknowledging the inherent imbalance of power between funders and nonprofits and creating an approach that fully appreciates that nonprofit leaders are knowledgeable and experts whose perspectives should be respected and valued. And a key deliverable from trust-based philanthropy is making grants that actually support organizations, and those grants are oftentimes unrestricted. So one of the things when we talk about embracing trust-based philanthropy, we ask that funders remove restrictions that impede organizational growth and limit effectiveness. We all remember how effective philanthropy was during COVID, and they were effective because we started to see some flexibility that previously had not been associated with philanthropy. They allowed nonprofit organizations to repurpose grants. They allowed us to use previous grants for program support for operating. Those are the types of approaches that still must be revisited and re-implemented today when we talk about trust-based philanthropy. Now, one example that I gave you is that the funders allowed folks to repurpose grants, and that was incredibly impactful. Let me give you another quote from the report from a Black leader as it pertains to the trust-based philanthropy recommendation. If you give me an operational grant that is going to support a position on the development team, then we can raise money. There are ways to support us and give us flexibility. Now, that quote confirmed once again what was learned from the 2016 report, that Black nonprofit organizations were continually asked to do more with less. And that leads me into another complicated issue, and I think many folks can understand when we talk about capacity building. All right, historically, funders have invested in what they have called capacity building. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, what they call capacity building has been delivered with two conditions, either as a prerequisite for future funding or as a consolation for being declined. But there's something more that's a little more complicated. And that is oftentimes capacity building isn't really capacity building, it's actually capability building, predicated on the assumption that the nonprofit leaders are lacking the skills to do better. What we advocate in the report is that funders consider both capacity building and capability building, okay? You don't want to be an executive director and you're already wearing 35 hats and you're being asked to go to a 3-hour training on development. If you support a development position, that development person can go to that development training. We're talking about a combination of capability building and true capacity building, which is actually supporting staffing and the infrastructure so you can do more. And I think from my own personal experience, I often mention one of the more impactful grants that I received when I was leading a nonprofit organization was an investment from the Nelson Foundation to help my organization do development work. It allowed us to hire a development officer who was able to do development, not just grant writing, but the whole scope of development that allowed our organization to grow. Not just suggesting that I go to another 4-hour development training. I needed staff. So what we're asking funders is to consider supporting infrastructure, capacity, and capability. The third recommendation is trust Black leaders. We're not incompetent, and we do not deserve to be relegated to an assigned risk pool of nonprofit leaders. One respondent stated, I think at the heart of it is trust. When you're a Black leader, it's like funders are asking, if I give you more money, can I trust you to be responsible? Do you even know what to do with that much money? So those three recommendations really build on each other. If you get to know us, you can alter longstanding grant-making orthodoxies and embrace trust-based philanthropy. If you get to know us, you'll trust Black nonprofit leaders and your grant-making will be more impactful. This is in pursuit of equity, but the reality is it is good, sound grant-making. It is good business. Next. So we talk about what can you do? We did this report. We know that funders, more than anything, they want to get it right. And we believe that the recommendations will help to get it right, because addressing these 3 recommendations is, as I mentioned, good grant making. Secondly, in my new role at the United Way as Managing Director of Leadership Equity, I'm working on creating a Center for Leadership Equity that will focus on equitable funding, nonprofit leadership development, increased diversity in both sectors, enhancing organizational capacity, and creating a stronger social infrastructure to improve community outcomes. So when we ask, what can you do? Read the report. It's online. You can find it from the UAC website or the United Way website. Engage your peer organizations around it. Share it with your boards and staff. Reflect on your grant-making practices and how they can be challenged and altered to ensure that equity is centered. And explore committing to true capacity. Okay, and that's the end of my particular section. What I'd like to do is turn it over to Mindy Aldridge from the Nelson Foundation. And I gave an example of the experience I had with Mindy. And Mindy was one of the funders that I could say she got it right, and she was working towards getting it right. Mindy.
Thank you, Kelly. And that's a hard act to follow, but I'm going to give it a whirl. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and to take part of Impact 100's panel this evening. Reflecting Forward is a really important report and topic to dig into. Tonight, I hope to provide some thoughts and reflections from a funder's point of view. For those of you who don't know about the Nelson Foundation, it's an independent private foundation that makes grants to youth-serving organizations and has since 1987. As a relatively small funder, the foundation awards roughly $800,000 a year in the greater Philadelphia area. You can advance the slide, thanks. So everybody has a journey in racial equity. Our journey in racial equity began as a direct consequence of our nation's racial reckoning in the spring and summer of 2020. The foundation had intended to embark on its next strategic plan in 2021, but the board decided in the fall of 2020 to center its new plan on racial equity and social justice. Here you see our new vision, where the foundation addresses head-on the need to eliminate systemic failures in order for young people to have bright futures. You can go ahead and advance. So what does it mean to center racial equity and social justice? Well, first of all, I want to talk about the hub versus the spoke, and say that there have been many well-intended efforts to incorporate DEI, but as a spoke on the wheel. And often when that happens, DEI is not prioritized, or it becomes sidelined to something else or a new priority. The foundation's board felt it was imperative to make DEI the hub, the core of what the foundation does and how it does it. So the foundation also had to develop a new mission, which is to eliminate systemic and social inequities by investing for impact with partner organizations in Greater Philadelphia that are committed to serving young people, their families, and the communities in which they live. We also set new values of accountability, equity, partnership, transparency, and humility. The new strategic plan was approved and launched, if you will, in early 2022. And with that new plan, there were also 5 strategic pillars that were built into the plan and are the framework for our equity action plan, implementation plan. And those range from organizational culture to governance and operations to philanthropic practices, community engagement, and investments. There's lots more information if you're interested on our website. I invite you to visit it. It's maybe somebody can put it in the chat, but it's www.nelsonfoundationpa.org. Obviously, this is a huge undertaking for the foundation, is transformational, and is a multi-year effort, which sometimes gives me a little agita because it's a lot and we're a two-person staff. You can go ahead and advance the slide. So the core grant program was really one of the first areas that we wanted to address. It is the core of our grant making, and it is the most public part of what we do, what the nonprofit community sees. So some important considerations for tonight's conversation that I wanted to highlight, and for those organizations that we wanted to attract, that meant that we had to keep our vision and mission central in the development of a new core grant program, that applicants who might apply have their own commitment to equity, including who they serve and how they are led. We wanted to focus on smaller community-based organizations, which, as Kelly said earlier, are often BIPOC-led and are closer to the people that they serve. And we wanted to be open to organizations that are fiscally sponsored as well, because many Black-led efforts do not have the resources to attain or maintain independent 501c3 status. So these were important eligibility requirements that we wanted to build into the revamped core grant program. You can go ahead and advance. And along with that, we were very deliberate and intentional about the key evaluation criteria and considerations for the ultimate selection of our next round of grantees. The foundation realizes that each organization, including our own, is in a different place and on its own DEI journey, but all of these that are listed here, and I'm not going to read them, reflect the foundation's own commitments within our mission and strategic pillars. Further, while the old grant program incorporated some principles of trust-based philanthropy, we've worked hard to infuse additional best practices into the revamped core grant program. And you heard Kelly talk about the importance of trust-based philanthropy when you talk about supporting Black-led nonprofits. So some of the things we did is we moved from 2-year to 3-year general operating grants. We simplified and shortened our letter of inquiry. It's now staff's responsibility to get to know applicants. We ensured that each question on the application matches directly with an evaluation question that we need to assess. We've streamlined the process. We've eliminated interim reports. We're in the process of developing a shorter process for existing grantees to reapply. We've committed, and we just completed our LOI phase of the first grant cycle, provided written feedback to each applicant who was declined. And we added feedback questions to each of our forms so that applicants could leave us information about what they liked or didn't like. And we also provided a link to an anonymous survey form as well, because I realized that some applicants might be hesitant to give critical feedback when they're applying for a grant. And in addition, and again, I think this ties directly back to what Kelly was talking about, we've substantially increased our commitment to beyond the grant support. You can go ahead and advance again. Thank you. So what does all of this mean for the development of new grant program? You know, I wanted to first say that to me personally, the foundation, if I had to pick a couple of values that were most important in the development and the rollout of this new core grant program, the top ones for me would be equity, partnership, and humility. A big part of what we did to get ready for the launch this January was months of intentional reaching out to new and often BIPOC organizations through funder and nonprofit colleagues, including Kelly was very helpful, BIPOC leaders, and we also made a big effort to attend any event where we thought there might be organizations who would be interested in the grant program and who may be BIPOC-led. So I think, again, that ties directly back to much of what Kelly was talking about getting to know us. And I found the report Reflecting Forward and Kelly's work around this to have been tremendously valuable and actionable in our own foundation's shift to centering racial equity and social justice. And I hope that many of you on this call will find the same and find some actions that you can take. And that's all I had.
Thank you so much, Mindy. Thank you, Kelly. My goodness, I'm so struck by how great it is to hear from the two of you, the research findings, and then also how those findings work in practice. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about how you're seeing this work play out in the field. And I'll say in the region, but if you have things you want to talk about beyond our region, we can do that too. Kelly, I'm going to start with you. You bring such a great vantage point given your wealth of experience on both sides of the funding desk, both as a nonprofit leader and as a funder. Reflecting on the 5+ years since that original report on the differences between Black and white-led nonprofits was published, and now with the release of Reflecting Forward, I'm wondering what you think has changed for the better for Black nonprofit leaders. And if there are areas that have gotten worse, what are those? Why do you think that is?
Okay, thanks, Kim. I think that's a very interesting question. The one thing that I can say since the first report was released in 2016, and understanding that everything is a process and everything evolves, the landscape, in a way, has become more fertile for change. I think some of the initial DEI trainings and conversations have been sparked by the report. I would say, for example, I think in 2016, the Philanthropy Network of Greater Philadelphia approved the formation of a DEI committee to offer workshops and training opportunities for regional funders. That was key, a key step in helping to not only influence the climate, but the landscape. And I definitely want to give appreciation to that, because what we're trying to do now is building on all of that. So as I talk about, the landscape having some fertile ground, I think, pointing to what Philanthropy Network started to do. I think in 2017, Diverse Force, which led by Suleiman Rahman, created the Diverse Force on Boards training for leaders of color to help address the lack of racial and ethnic diversity on nonprofit boards. Again, another key foundational block upon which to build. In 2018, the Philadelphia Black Giving Circle was established to really distribute pooled funds to Black-led, Black-serving organizations. In June 2020, building on all of that work, I was fortunate enough to be one of the co-founders of what is now called the Black Nonprofit Chief Executives of Philadelphia. And we were formed in June 2020. And now that group has over 130 members, and we meet monthly via Zoom. The Philadelphia Foundation's Black Leaders Fund started in 2021. I think another outgrowth of that. So there's been a lot of good work, a lot of stuff to build on. But let me share with you the flip side, because I think this is important as well. There seems to be a sense of, and I was talking to someone recently, maybe there's DEI fatigue. And if you've been a Black American in this country, you know that the benevolence of the majority community oftentimes has a short shelf life, and you're always waiting for the window to close. So I've heard some concerns and conversations about that. Like, are things starting to shift back and go the other way? In the work that I'm doing, I have to keep that in consideration. But what I can say is, if there is fatigue, if there is fear about the window closing, what I'm trying to do is create a door that is really opened by actions. So we've had a good amount of trainings that have helped to create a good climate. And what I'm trying to do through the work at the United Way is to really create and deliver some actionable things. I think also there's still some funders, generally, when we talk about some of the things that are a concern, a going concern, there's still some funders that have restrictions around grant making that need to be revisited. We've talked about before, organizations that have fiscal sponsors. Those are organizations that still must be included in grant making and eligibility for grant making, because fiscal sponsorship is a critical step towards an organization growing. Oftentimes I hear a lot of folks saying, well, gee, this Black organization, they're grassroots. I'm fine with an organization being grassroots, because coming from the nonprofit sector, grassroots means you're closer to the work, the proximity to the issues, you have a greater closeness. But the flip side of grassroots has a pejorative understanding, and oftentimes people use that to connote unsophisticated, low capacity. Organizations, Black-led organizations, often stay in this purgatory because they don't receive the type of grants necessary to be able to grow. So we must be able to remove some of those restrictions to grant making that are impediments to organizations growing. So you don't have an organization that's been grassroots for 20 years. And I think fiscal sponsorship is one key to that. The other thing that is still a concern is that there are still some agencies that will get funded because they have the capacity to have the best proposal writers and not necessarily the best work. But if you have someone who can tell your story better, that has tended to work. I think a positive that I do see, and I'll just tout what the United Way has done in our recent partnership grant fund, is we try to center equity in the development of the application so that everyone has an opportunity to put their best foot forward. And it isn't predicated on how well you can spin your tale or articulate, tell your story, what have you. So I think those are some of the things. I've tried to give you both some of the positives and then some of the concerns that we're seeing.
That's helpful. Thank you. Could you, I'm going to hand this to Mindy in a second, but could you just in 30 seconds define what you mean by fiscal sponsorship, Kelly?
Fiscal sponsorship is when an organization doesn't have their 501c3, but they will use the 501c3 of a fiscal sponsor, of a larger organization that will be able to provide the back office accounting and some of the management support that a small organization needs as they're just starting off. So the Urban Affairs Coalition has been a vital organization providing fiscal sponsorship for many years. And there have been many organizations that have been sponsored by the Urban Affairs Coalition before they went to stand on their own. Fiscal sponsorship is helpful because oftentimes smaller organizations don't have large, robust budgets. And funders are going to make determinations based on your audited income, your revenue. Well,
sorry, I was just going to add that from a funder perspective, one of the what we do require if you're applying as a fiscally sponsored organization is that you actually have an agreement with your fiscal sponsor.
Yeah.
So that's where I think sometimes funders get a little nervous, is there can be funny things that go on if you don't have an official document, agreement, outlining that relationship. As long as that is in place, funders should not worry.
Right.
And it is, as Kelly said, a very useful mechanism for startup organizations.
Mindy, I'm going to hand this to you then, since you were the bridge just now on the fiscal sponsor question to a funder. If you have additional reflections, I'll start with what, if anything, are you hearing from Black-led organizations that you support at Nelson or among your board members or other partners?
A little bit to just echo, but maybe in a slightly different way, what Kelly said. I'm not sure it's exactly fatigue, but I do think that in 2020 and the beginning of 2021, we had what I would call the natural disaster syndrome, when everybody comes rushing in a natural disaster and gives, and then it kind of loses its legs from a visibility standpoint, and it kind of dies away. Whereas as in this initiative, to be better supporting Black-led nonprofits or natural disaster, the need goes on. And I think that that's one of the compelling reasons to kind of go back to the hub idea, which is if you make racial equity and social justice the core of what you're doing, it cannot get sidelined. Other things cannot interfere. So I just wanted to say that. As far as my perspective on what I'm seeing in the funder community in general, I would still say there's a lot of lack of understanding still about these issues, and who, by the way, the funder community are typically white-led. So they don't understand as I think Kelly spoke very eloquently about, the financial and structural challenges that Black nonprofits face. So I think that that's definitely still out there, although I think it's improving. I think that there's still, in many funders, a preference to not give funding to organizations that have a substantial amount of government funding. And again, that's just a lack of understanding. The foundation was there. I mean, I would tell you 6 years ago, that was still one of our things that we would consider, is how much government funding you got. And that's gone now because we've been enlightened. And also sometimes a lot of funders look at balanced fund development. So, and what they don't realize, again, is a lack of individual giving is, again, part and parcel of, as Kelly mentioned, not having the social capital, not having the friends and family to call and say, I need $10,000. So all of this we've tried to do away with. And I think there's still work to be done there. Having said that, I also do think there's definitely a lot of movement in trust-based philanthropy and DEI initiatives. Some funders have initiated specific grant programs to serve Black-led nonprofits, and that's very exciting. Some are hosting get-to-know-you events, piggybacking on exactly Kelly's work. And a couple are beginning to incorporate DEI as a value. I'm not seeing enough of them actually committing their vision and mission to this, and I'd like to see that. And I guess that's my big surprise, is that I would have thought and hoped, at least, that more foundations would have explicitly incorporated or centered DEI in the work that they do. And for the most part, I think staffs of funders are ahead of their boards.
Yeah.
So you hear staff wanting to, and then hitting the block of, or the hurdle of the boards. And some of that is their family foundations, and it's kind of, that's a different animal. And a lot of them need to just incorporate more diversity on their board so that they get more perspectives.
Thank you both for those reflections. We have a fair number of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to pivot to that because we have about 10 minutes left in our time together. But you both know, and I'm going to make a commitment to our audience, that I do want to, if you have a quick takeaway for Impact 100 as a funder and our members, I want to get to that, but I want to wait until our participants get a chance to ask some Q&A. So I think Ashley Foyer Edwards, our programs chair, is going to drop in here with some Q&A from or with the Q's. You guys are going to give the A.
Thanks, Kim. I'm going to stay off camera. I'll just be the voice in the sky here. But yeah, so we had a question, one for Mindy. And if you did submit a question, we're kind of answering these in the order they were received. So just be patient because we'll definitely try to get to all of them. So she wanted to know how, if you could speak a bit more about how the staff at the Nelson Foundation gets to know organizations. You talked about how you kind of took more of this on proactively for the staff to do. Can you, and she really liked the idea of that and wanted to get a better sense, like tactically, how that works for you at your organization.
Sure. And, and again, it's evolving for us. This is our first grant cycle with the revamped grant program. I would say, first of all, a lot of it started before the application process itself, in just getting out there into the community and meeting new nonprofits that we did not know, and BIPOC-led nonprofits. So that was a piece of it. So we got to know them a little bit, and then they got to know us, and then we're able to apply. During the letter of inquiry phase, I would say we overachieved in our reaching out to folks. And really got swamped with letters of inquiry, which is great, but we had 400% more LOIs this grant cycle than we've ever had before. So not easy to get to know Black leaders or BIPOC leaders during the LOI phase, but the way we structured the LOI made the staff go out and find out more about the organization. So, and there was a lot of scouring that was going on, whether that was on websites or through GuideStar. We did do a fair amount of reach out to people who applied through the letter of inquiry, but it's not perfect. During the application phase, now we've invited a subset of the applicants that submitted LOIs. We will, in fact, we just went through it, all but one is going to require a site visit. So, we hope to then get to know them much better through that process and through the application, which, as much as we would have liked to have made that short and simple, because of our focus on racial equity and social justice, it's fairly intense. And for current grantees, again, continuing on, we have get-togethers, we will have phone calls. We've also committed to more community engagement. So we're trying to take part in events that go on in the communities, things of that nature.
Thank you, Mindy. Another question, have you seen, and I think this could go to either Kelly or Mindy, do you see any trends in the willingness to move towards these more equitable approaches to funding between different kinds of funders? Like, for example, are community foundations more open to it than family foundations or giving circles? Like, are there anything that you kind of see, as you look at your funding colleagues?
The only one I'm just going to say that I think has just inherently more challenge, at least from the board level, is the family foundation. So if you're trying to really have a diversified board, but your board is made up of family members and they're all white, that's a challenge. And that may drive a lot of the thinking of the foundation. Not always. I want to be perfectly fair with that. Like the Patricia Kind Family Foundation has done tremendous work in this area. That's the only perspective I have, really.
No, I kind of echo that. I think community foundations inherently, by how they're structured and created, tend to be maybe at the forefront. I think when you look at our local community foundation, Philadelphia Foundation tries very hard to be equity centered. I think the point that Mindy made earlier was very key, and that is the staffs of these organizations, of these foundations, are a little more forward, but it takes a little more work to deal with the board. So I think that's the condition that you're dealing with, basically.
And part of that's because the staff is closer to the nonprofits
Right.
and the community served. So they're kind of getting it more firsthand than the board is.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
That's
Oh, sorry. Can I do
I was just
one more
gonna,
thing?
that's a theme, but yeah, sure, of course, absolutely. I was just gonna note that that's a theme, right? Those closest to the work, whatever the work is,
Mhm.
whether it's the nonprofit or you're serving as a funder, those closest to the work have the answers. Go ahead, Ashley.
So we had one questioner who just expressed a little bit of frustration about as a Black-led small grassroots organization leader, having the experience of kind of doing all the right things that are outlined by the speaker, maintaining the 501(c)(3) status, taking leaps fiscally, but still not getting invited past the LOI phase. And I think just wanting to see if there's any recommendations or, reflections that you can share about, how to connect more to funders potentially, or how to, address those challenges for them.
As a funder, I would say it's tough. Even when you meet the eligibility requirements, it's a competitive field. And I mean, for example, it was really hard the last couple of weeks to go through all of these great organizations and know that you can only invite a fraction of them to the application. One of the things, again, that we tried to do was provide some feedback about what it was about the application or what you might be able to do better next time. And so that's what my suggestion would be, try to get some input from the foundations that you have applied to about whether it's just really not a good fit for what they're doing, or there's something you could have done better in your application.
Great. Kim, do we have time for one more, or do you think we need to move to our final thoughts?
I think we need to move to final thoughts with
All right,
apologies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. So our panel, I'm wondering if you could share with us before we go, perhaps one top takeaway. And we had talked in our preparation for this about the ways in which Impact 100 is a unique funder in our region. We are democratic, we are collective, we are money in, money out, right? There's no corpus we're talking about here, there's no family board. And that gives us a certain amount of flexibility, but there are other ways in which our model is not some of the ways that traditional funders are, right? We are, with a few exceptions, we are not typically a repeat funder. It's certainly possible within our guidelines, but it doesn't always happen. So cultivation looks a little different. And we are 377 members, and the decision each year is made by those women, which is different than getting to know folks. And this are some of the things that Kelly was outlining in the report. What is one takeaway, given on the eligibility criteria and all of those other things that we talked about in preparation for this conversation, that you would like Impact 100 members to take from this to think about as we go forward in our grant making journey?
Well, the only thing that I would say, you have over 300 members, you have over 300 tentacles into the community. It's incumbent upon those members to know this community, to get to know, to do more than scratch the surface. It's unrealistic. No one knows who Impact 100 members are. I mean, I had applied, I definitely identify with the person that wrote the message. I ran an organization and applied to Impact 100, and we got past the LOI, but we didn't get any further. But there's a lot of applicants. But I think it's incumbent upon organizations, foundations, to try to get to know. Oftentimes, staff capacity is limited, but when you say you have over 300 some members, what is the charge or the requirement of members as it pertains to the grant making time to get out and know? And if they can't do it, who can they contact to make sure that as much information is obtained around the folks that are doing the work and applications are given to more than just the usual suspects? The other thing, and I definitely understand you lowered, when you use the term lowered to 300,000, I would say removing that. There's a lot of folks who are doing good work that can't get a leg up because of that, in addition to the fiscal sponsorship eligibility requirement that we talked about. So those would be my only points.
So
Thank you, Mindy.
Yeah, I would say, I looked at actually your About Us, and you have this very nice statement that you put out in 2020 related to DEI and racial equity. I think you have to live by those words. This was a conversation that we had in 2020 with our board when we wanted to come out with a statement. And I have a very diverse board. And my now chairman said, if we say something, we have to do something. And so you have a very compelling statement out on your website, but I think you could be doing more. So whether it's go smaller, fiscally sponsored organizations, I think you can be more intentional.
Okay. Thank you both so much for that. What's that? Say that again.
That's my challenge.
I have goosebumps from both of your challenges. If you can't see it on Zoom, but these are exciting. These are very exciting. Thank you. I want to thank you both so much for giving us an hour of your time this evening publicly, and the many hours of emails and phone calls and Zooms and so on that have gone into producing this event for this evening for our Impact 100 members who attended, as well as those from the funding and nonprofit community who are compelled enough by the description of the event to want to join us. Thank you so much to our programs committee chairs, Ashley Foyer Edwards and Nancy Gottlieb, who, as well as members of the program committee who made this evening possible, Kate Henson and Jeannie McGill, who are some of our tech folks this evening. Thank you to Carrie Sundermeyer and our communications team, Eileen O'Donnell and Sarah Wimberly, for making sure everyone knew about this event and got registered and got the Zoom and all of that stuff. Thank you to all of you who joined us. This is such incredible food for thought. And I'm so inspired and excited by what is in front of Impact 100 for certain, but for all of us as we continue to listen to each other more and do the good work that needs to be done as a result of that listening. If you liked what you heard this evening and you'd like to join Impact 100, if you're a woman as old as 21 or above, and you'd like to be part of Women's Collective Giving in our region, please do join. Please get on our email list if you're not already there. Certainly visit the Nelson Foundation, as well as finding Kelly's work with United Way to keep tabs on what they're up to. It's all good stuff, and we only can get better by continuing to learn. To Impact 100 members who are on tonight, we look forward to seeing you at our annual meeting on June 5th. Thank you all. Any other parting words? If not, happy spring, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.